Hi there, everybody. Hope everyone's had a good weekend. This week is looking good. We are going to today be talking about racial health disparities and how the intersections there occur, and what are some of those key concepts and key things that we should be cognizant of as potential healthcare providers or any sort of researcher or medical sociologist, whatever it might be. These are really important topics that we're going to talk to today. And there's some really good readings that have assigned as well. And you can see the summary of the readings as well in the slide notes that I'll obviously post to the Moodle page. But we're going to get into this today because it's very, very important, like I said, very foundational to a topic. It's a very foundational topic in medical sociology. So be thinking about racial and ethnic disparities in health as they persist despite medical and technological advancements. What are the reasons for those inequities still persisting? We're going to talk all through racial health disparities, social determinants of health, structural racism, these key concepts that we're going to talk through today. And it's really important to study racial health disparities within medical sociology. Because, like I said, how do we have those more upstream efforts compared to downstream efforts? How do we tackle the root causes of public health issues rather than just treating symptoms or effects of those root causes themselves? So, we'll get into a summary of readings as well. We'll get into the readings for today and even the videos as well. And just want to highlight up top though that racial health disparities are significant differences in health outcomes across racial and ethnic groups. That's what we mean when we refer to that, and that these disparities are not just biological health disparities. Rather, they're heavily influenced by social and economic and structural factors. That's what we're diving into today. So let's start I want a couple of basic sociological foundational components here about how race and ethnicity shape our lives and shape our lives in very day-to-day fashion. So race and ethnicity, they shape lived experiences, right? They shape lived experiences in distinct yet very interconnected ways. So they influence various aspects of individuals' lives and of our lives, including our identity, our social interactions, our access to opportunities, and of course, as we'll talk about today, our health related outcomes. So there are a few key components here that I want to talk through of how race shapes lived experience. And number one, identity formation. So race is a fundamental aspect of personal and collective social identity, influencing how individuals see themselves and how they are perceived by others. It's critical in terms of how the world perceives us, how we perceive the world. Discrimination and inequality. Racial identities often determine the likelihood of experiencing discrimination and systematic inequality. And this affects access to resources such as education, employment, housing, and healthcare. So it's some really powerful influence here into our day-to-day and long-term livelihoods. Social interactions. So racial stereotypes and biases influence social interactions as well, leading to differential treatment and social exclusion or inclusion, depending on certain groups or certain situations, even our health industry. Criminal justice. So racial profiling and biases within the criminal justice system can result in disproportionate rates of policing, of incarceration, and sentencing of certain racial groups. So that's obviously very, very important to understand as well, especially when we talked in previous class period, things like social stress related to discrimination, right? How that impacts long-term health. And then economic opportunities. So racial discrimination in the labor market can limit job opportunities, career advancement, even income levels. So all these are key examples of how race shapes our lived experience. And I think it's just foundational to understand this before we get into talking about the nuances of racial health disparities in particular. But let's also talk about ethnicity too. So how ethnicity shapes our lives. So ethnicity shapes our cultural identity. So ethnicity provides a sense of belonging through shared language, traditions, values, and customs, shaping individuals' cultural identity and practices. Also, our community and social networks. So ethnic groups often form close-knit communities that offer support and resources and social networks, influencing things like social cohesion and mutual aid, for instance. Cultural heritage, and practices. Ethnicity influences everyday practices, dietary habits, celebrations, religious beliefs, and various cultural expressions as well. Social capital is another key element here. So ethnic communities can provide social capital such as connections and networks that facilitate access to different resources and opportunities. That social capital component is really critical. I think we talked about that in maybe the first day or two when we went through some of the key elements of sociology. But in terms of social capital with ethnicity, right, those types of communities that provide social networks, that provide connections and facilitate that access to things like resources and opportunities, that is so critical, especially when you think of health. And then finally, 5, integration and multiculturalism. Ethnicity shapes our experiences of integration, of assimilation, multiculturalism in diverse societies, and that affects how we navigate and blend different cultural contexts as well. So there's a lot of key elements here how race and ethnicity shape our lives. So as a summary, again, some of the differences between race and ethnicity just in general. So race refers to a categorization based on more physical characteristics like skin color, facial features, hair texture, while ethnicity refers to the shared cultural identity, including language, ancestry, religion, traditions, and customs. And so, in summary, as well, race often shapes lived experiences through structural inequalities and social perceptions, while ethnicity shapes cultural practices and community bonds, both significantly influencing individuals' identities and individual opportunities. So, both have profound impacts on our lived experiences, on our day-to-days, and our long-term lived experience. So let's get into some of the readings though. Just to start with Barkin and the Cochrane readings, just as an overview, okay, just as an overall summary, is that socioeconomic status and race intersect to shape health outcomes, that historical and systemic racism in healthcare exists, and that social inequality is a root cause of racial health disparities. So that's just a very high level summary. But let's dive in a bit further, shall we? So the Barkin reading, the textbook reading from chapter 3, a couple of pages in there. So this section of Barkin is examining how socioeconomic status significantly impacts health outcomes and how race and ethnicity intersect with socioeconomic status, which then exacerbates health disparities. And it really highlights that racial minorities often experience lower socioeconomic status, which then in turn, as we've talked about already, affects their access to healthcare, to quality of care they receive, and their overall health outcomes. So these key concepts around racial minorities and lower socioeconomic status that Barkin discusses in the textbook, in the reading. So number one, there's that access to healthcare, right? But I want to emphasize that lower socioeconomic status is disproportionately experienced by racial minorities. So such as Black, Hispanic, Native American, or other marginalized groups, say in the United States, these racial minorities disproportionately experience lower socioeconomic status compared to non-white to white individuals. And so these individuals, because of that, are more likely to face economic barriers like lower wages, underemployment, unemployment, poor living conditions, all these things which have direct health implications like we've discussed already. And so key aspects here I want to talk through, access to healthcare being one. So lower socioeconomic groups often face barriers to healthcare access, including lack of insurance, transportation issues, living in healthcare deserts where providers are more scarce. And this contributes to things like delayed diagnoses and more chronic health issues, all the things we discussed in the socioeconomic status day. Quality of care, another area here. So discrimination within healthcare systems can result in lower quality of care for racial minorities. So this might include longer waiting times, misdiagnoses, or even less attention to health outcomes, which ultimately worsen health outcomes over time, both acutely and over time. And then health outcomes overall. So the cumulative effects of diagnosis, of discrimination, we'll get into that in just a second, actually. The cumulative, so over and over, build upon itself, effects of discrimination and economic hardship lead to higher rates of chronic diseases like hypertension, like diabetes and asthma and heart disease among racial minorities. Again, presenting themselves more disproportionately in both prevalence and severeness in racial minorities because of these things. So in the text as well, Barkin notes that racial minorities face a quote unquote double burden of lower socioeconomic status and the additional challenges posed by racial discrimination in healthcare. So, for example, Black Americans are more likely to experience poor health outcomes like infant mortality, chronic illnesses, and mental health illnesses due to the compounded effects of both poverty and racism. So, think about examples from the text about structural inequalities, including like segregation, discriminatory policies, a lack of access to resources in certain communities, how these things contribute to persistent health issues by racial minorities. And just continuing on this as well, on the Barkin chapter 5 reading, continuing on. This section of Barkin's work focuses on the history and the ongoing presence of systemic racism within healthcare institutions, and they're addressing how discriminatory practices in medical treatment and healthcare access, how these contribute to health disparities. So Barkin argues that racism is not just an individual issue, but rather a structural problem embedded in the healthcare system itself in a similar way that it's embedded in other social institutions in the United States. If you've heard the term structural or systemic racism. And so a couple of key elements here to talk through: systemic racism in healthcare and the cumulative effect of discrimination, like I mentioned before. So systemic racism in healthcare. So racism manifests in healthcare through discriminatory practices such as racial profiling by healthcare providers, biased medical decision-making, and denial of access to certain treatments based on race. So for example, studies have actually shown that Black patients are less likely to receive pain management treatments or pain medications for conditions than compared to their white counterparts. So things like sickle cell anemia or arthritis as being examples in these studies. And the historical legacy of racism in healthcare, think about things like the Tuskegee experience, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, and these sorts of things that demonstrate that historical legacy of racism in healthcare. This legacy and the exclusion of certain racial groups from access to medical advancements, they all have this cumulative effect. They have this historical component. It's really just important to understand the context of where we've been, where improvements have been made, but understanding that there is a historical legacy of discrimination on racial bounds, on racial bases in the United States, in Western medicine. So let's talk about the cumulative effect of discrimination. So here's want to stress how this cumulative effect of systemic racism, again, structural racism, not just on the individual level, broader structural racism, over time leads to issues of chronic stress and poor health outcomes for marginalized groups. So for example, Black Americans may experience higher rates of hypertension or even heart disease due to the long-term exposure of racial discrimination in healthcare and other aspects of society. We know just statistically these things can be disproportionately prevalent in racial minority populations in the United States, partially due to this cumulative effect of discrimination over time, that repeat exposure to discrimination and discriminatory practices that leads to those chronic stress, hypertension, heart disease, those sorts of things. Let's move on to the Cochrane reading now. So Cochrane, I believe it's chapter 4, discusses the fundamental causes of disease and the role of institutional racism as well. So in this section, Cochrane explores how social structures, including institutional racism, how these things contribute to health disparities, similar to Barkin. And he discusses the fundamental causes of disease. So highlighting how racial and ethnic health disparities are deeply rooted in broader social inequities rather than just purely biological factors. So fundamental causes of disease. Let's just talk about that first. Cochrane builds on the concept of fundamental causes of disease, which we read in the Phelan readings, if you remember that back a week or so ago. And the fundamental causes of disease suggest that social factors like race and class and education determine access to resources that influence health outcomes. Those resources being healthcare, healthy environments, economic stability, things like that. And then racial and ethnic disparities are often shaped by those social determinants, such as income and education and discrimination in the workplace, discrimination in healthcare, and discrimination just within your neighborhoods. So that's the fundamental causes of disease, looking at, again, those more root causes of looking at those key foundational impacts. And then the role of institutional racism, Cochrane also discusses. And institutional racism refers to the discriminatory policies and practices that exist within institutions. So healthcare, education, employment, these things that disproportionately affect racial minorities. So for instance, racial minorities may face discriminatory hiring practices, limited access to quality education, and segregated neighborhoods, all of which we know have impacts on overall health. So stress from discrimination, both everyday stress, but also that historical stress and repeat stress, and even reduced, as well as reduced economic opportunities. These things result in things like mental health challenges, like depression and anxiety, as well as physical health problems like hypertension, cardiovascular disease. So that's when we talk about the impacts, the actual health-related impacts of racism and institutionalized racism. They're profound and real. And a couple of other key takeaways here. Number one, socioeconomic status and race intersect to shape health outcomes. So racial minorities often experience lower socioeconomic status, like we've talked about, which contributes to disparities in healthcare access and quality of care, all of which exacerbate health inequalities. Number two there, historical and systemic racism in healthcare. So discriminatory practices in healthcare, along with the cumulative effect of racism, like we just mentioned. These things have long-term health-related consequences for marginalized groups in society. So also really important to understand that. And then three, social inequality as a root cause of racial health disparities. So institutional racism and social inequalities are foundational causes of racial health disparities. So addressing these health inequities requires reform and efforts beyond healthcare systems, to include those broader social, economic, and political challenges. Remember, we need those downstream approaches to address these things. Once we understand that these are real and profound and having real impacts on marginalized groups in society, then we can use more community-based approaches, more downstream efforts to tackle root causes of diseases, to tackle root causes of discrimination leading to racial health disparities. That's the really big takeaway here. Additionally, now there were other readings too, and a couple of videos that we watched for the day. The Williams and Sternthal reading from 2010. So discusses a few things. So this article explores how sociological perspectives, in particular, contribute to understanding the racial and ethnic health disparities front, and emphasizing the role of discrimination as a significant stress that contributes directly to these disparities. The authors highlight the importance of social factors and the psychological stress caused by discrimination, all of which can have very harmful both physical and mental health consequences for racial minorities. And then the article also categorizes discrimination into various forms that we'll talk about, forms such as institutional discrimination and interpersonal discrimination. And then the authors here argue that addressing these forms of discrimination requires substantial policy changes and policy measures and proactive measures and reform compared to how we're currently addressing these things. So number one, let's go over some key takeaways, some key big ideas here. Discrimination as a stressor. So Williams and Sternthal argue that discrimination is not just a social issue. Rather, it is also a health issue. That's why we're talking about it in medical sociology. And they highlight how experiencing discrimination, whether that be institutional or interpersonal, we'll talk about what those two things are. Either of those things contribute to chronic stress, which in turn affects health outcomes. So a couple of key terms here: chronic stress and biological pathways. So chronic stress is that the constant pressure of discrimination, how that leads to long-term psychological stress, which can then elevate the risk of conditions like hypertension, cardiovascular disease, mental health disorders, and even early mortality. And then biological pathways they also talk about. So talking about how chronic stress can affect the body through mechanisms like increased cortisol levels. So that's your stress hormones. When you have increased cortisol levels, that can harm the immune system and contribute to inflammation, both of which are linked to various other diseases. So that's what we talk about when discrimination has a health issue. It's both that chronic stress, but also those biological pathways. So number two, categories for discrimination. Talked about institutional and interpersonal. So let's start with interpersonal. Interpersonal discrimination is the everyday discrimination that people face in their personal interactions with others. So, for example, would include racial slurs, microaggressions, or being treated unfairly by healthcare service providers or colleagues based on racial or ethnic background. So this type of discrimination contributes to that psychosocial stress, which in turn influences physical health. Now, institutional discrimination, on the other hand, this refers to discriminatory practices embedded in social, political, or economic institutions. So these could include biased policies and practices in areas like education or employment and healthcare. These practices that influence or disadvantage racial minorities. So, for example, healthcare access might be limited for minority populations due to structural barriers such as lack of insurance or lack of culturally competent care. So again, important to understand the differences there between interpersonal discrimination and institutional discrimination. While both are important and both are intersecting, especially as we look at the impacts on health. And let's look at that, health implications of discrimination. Number three, discrimination, whether institutional, whether interpersonal, is not just an abstract concept, but has real measurable health consequences. So for example, research has shown that Black Americans often experience racial discrimination in healthcare, and that leads to misdiagnoses, delayed treatments, and worse health outcomes. And that the accumulation of discriminatory experiences over time, often referred to as, maybe you've heard this term in the past, the weathering hypothesis, where you'd be weathered of this accumulation of those discriminatory experiences over time. This contributes to things like premature aging and poor health outcomes for racial minorities. Really thinking about intersectionality approaches, right? Particularly think of Black women in America, experiencing both sexism and race. That intersectional approach becomes even more critical here to understand as we think about these things. So as we think about the Williamson-Sternthal reason, just want to highlight a couple of other key takeaways here. Number one, discrimination as a stressor. So both interpersonal and institutional discrimination contribute to chronic stress, which negatively impacts health. That chronic stress is a really big, important piece. That it's not that chronic is a key word here. Chronic stress. It's repeat. It's over time. It's consistent. Two, categories of discrimination. So understanding the difference between interpersonal and institutional discrimination is really crucial for addressing racial health disparities. We cannot address one effectively without addressing the other. We need to address both interpersonal and institutional side of racial discrimination. And then three, policy changes and social reform. So to reduce health disparities, it's necessary to enact policies that address systemic racism and improve access to healthcare and tackle the social determinants of health. All the things we've talked about, like poverty, education, and employment opportunities. I'm going to be emphasizing this throughout the entire course because that is such a critical takeaway that we, as we are practitioners or we become policymakers, community leaders, whatever it might be, that we address the structural components of the social determinants of health to address these root causes of health disparities, whether that be racial or socioeconomic status. So like we'll get into in future sessions, gender-related, age-related, so on and so forth. So there was this HBO video segment. Hope you enjoyed. I mean, it's John Oliver. He makes everything quite entertaining. I'm not going to go through every single. We're not going to actually watch together here, but I want to talk through a couple of the key areas here from the video. So this episode of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver illustrates and talks about bias in medical treatment, and he's really hitting on some data and some real life examples. So here's some key themes, some key takeaways from that video. Again, make sure you watch the whole thing though. So number one, implicit bias in healthcare and how that affects health outcomes. So the video emphasizes how healthcare providers, regardless of their intentions, oftentimes hold unconscious biases that affect their clinical decisions. So examples include disparities in pain management. We talked about that, where Black patients are less likely to receive adequate pain relief compared to white patients due to things like unconscious bias and stereotypes about pain tolerance. That second one there, historical context and structural racism. So the video, John Oliver makes reference to historical injustices, such as the Tuskegee syphilis study. And what these examples do is they help to illustrate how systemic racism has eroded trust in the medical system among communities of color. But that's a real issue here, that trust is continuing and has continued to decline. And these historical traumas contribute to even present day disparities, as seen as distrust in vaccines or reluctance to seek care because of that level of distrust. And some real life examples and data that they hit on as well. So the video uses statistical evidence and patient stories to demonstrate that racial disparities persist in multiple areas, including maternal mortality, heart disease treatment, diagnostic delays. That's really, really important to understand. And then also, I think a big takeaway here is that media can be a great catalyst for awareness and change. So by presenting these issues in a more widely viewed and digestible format, this segment is a really great example and underscores the role of media in raising awareness about these things and influencing public opinion on systemic health disparities and how these things can be powerful impactors. And then that need for systemic change. So that's critical, and that addressing biases requires systemic interventions, right? That including provider training, diverse representation in healthcare, policy reforms. These are the types of takeaways that we should be understanding from this course, understanding from examples like these videos and the historical examples and the other readings, that addressing bias requires that systemic intervention. And that means addressing racial health disparities requires systemic intervention. So again, I think it's important to also talk about what is implicit bias versus structural racism. So implicit bias refers to unconscious attitudes or stereotypes that affect understandings, actions, and decisions. And so that's things you're not even conscious of, that implicit bias that are causing still racial bias to be perceived in actions and be come through. Structural racism involves policies and practices ingrained in institutions, like we said, right, that produce and perpetuate racial inequalities. And so let's connect this video to a couple medical sociology concepts as well. So the social determinants of health, like race, socioeconomic status, neighborhood conditions, these things intersect with healthcare delivery. And John Oliver is talking about all these things in this video. And then the role of intersectionality, also critical, right? That race, gender, and socioeconomic status often compound disparities in health outcomes. And so I really encourage you, I want to challenge you to think about how implicit bias may operate in everyday medical interactions. Think about that. Think about how maybe it's perceived by the patient or even the provider, how these things are exhibited. And consider whether media representations like this segment can help reduce biases or risk. Maybe they risk oversimplifying the issue, right? What are the impacts of, as we have more and more popular segments like this addressing these types of issues? What is going to be the overall long-term impact of that? So I hope the video here was enjoyable. I think it's a really unique perspective on things and an example in many ways, right? So like I mentioned, in its example on providing really good examples and a good overview of this issue, but also a good example of how media can be a tool for advocacy. How someone like John Oliver talking about these issues, someone like John Oliver talking about the experiences of people, maybe not like him, but having a wide audience of millions of people, these things can push the needle in terms of how do we need structural change, right? And then another big takeaway, that to address issues of racial health disparities, we need to address systemic racism in in some of our institutions, in the healthcare industry. That is critical to understanding both that interpersonal discrimination as well as institutional and unconscious bias. Those things are critical. So that's really my synthesis and takeaway here. I just want to, again, think about how racial health disparities and understand that these things are influenced by socioeconomic factors, systemic racism, stress from discrimination, that cumulative effect, and even those overt biases in healthcare. And then just want to reemphasize the need for systemic solutions that address social determinants of health alongside improvements in healthcare systems. So that's really the general idea here. When we think about racial health disparities, think broader. Think about how that institutional racism that you hear about, it's not just a social experience. It is an actual biological and health-related experience as well. So these are really, we think about issues of life and death, right? That these are really, really important concepts that we have to understand, whether we are community leaders, whether we are healthcare providers. We need to understand these concepts to be better practitioners and to support our various communities in more holistic ways. So that's what I've got for this session today. If you have any questions about this topic, it's a really important one. I'll be really curious to see your discussion prompts for this week if you hit on this issue. But let me know of any questions that you have. Happy to meet one-on-one as always. But thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you next time.